But today's class from Gary's Kitchen will be on French onion soup. Now, when we send out the recipe, if you don't have the recipe, we can always send you another copy. But thanks, Brenda, for sending that out. There's two recipes. And the reason there's two recipes for today's call is there is an American version and a French version of French onion soup. And I chose to send both to you. We're going to do the American version. It's titled Applebee's French Onion Soup. The reason we're doing that one over the one that is really authentic French and even with a New Orleans flair is the Brennan's onion soup. So let's decipher what the difference is between the two. So really the French onion soup from Brennan's is got significant more cream and butter. There's egg yolk. So that one is even more of a velvety French onion soup. It's truly authentic. It's even got a kick of pepper, cayenne pepper in it, all-purpose flour. But the two main ingredients for both recipes are onions as well as beef stock. And I'll talk about the onions and I'll talk about the beef stock here in a minute. But with the Brennan's onion soup, you'll find that both are very simple, very easy to make. And I think what I also like about the recipe is it's relatively inexpensive. You can buy a bag of onions for maybe $2 or $3 to make this soup. The beef stock might be a couple more bucks, and you basically have the makings of French onion soup. But it's very elegant. When you serve this for dinner, the presentation, when you serve it to guests, it's a great entertainment soup to start a meal off. Most people like onions when they're cooked. It's not a real bad hit as far as the digestive system. And it's just very elegant when you serve it up. I'd like to thank my sous chef, Woodford, for being here today. He just parked his butt along. I think he wants to get some cheese. But let's talk about the Brennan's recipe a little bit more, and then we'll switch over to today's recipe. So you got more butter, you got the same onions, you got a little bit of flour in the Brennan's recipe. Just make sure when you put that flour in to make the roux, which is the basis of the broth, that you cook that flour for a little bit of time. Flour comes in a bag and it comes raw to you from the store. So if you would not cook that and just mix it in with broth, more than likely you're going to have a flour raw taste, which is not a very pleasant taste to have at all. And then you got the beef stock, a little bit of cayenne pepper for a kick. You can always delete that if that's something you do not like. But this is from New Orleans. So Brennan's is a fabulous, fabulous family name in New Orleans. Some great restaurants. Once again in New Orleans, had the Brennan's name, Brennan Steakhouse. This is where this one comes from, is the Brennan Steakhouse. But it's the family that is known for Commander's Palace, etc. So it's one of those recipes that it's a very go-to, very high-end, silky recipe with the egg yolks. It even has a little bit of cream to add to the butter. But those you don't really need to make today, because that makes that recipe a little bit more involved as far as ingredients, a little bit more difficult, because you got to make sure you do things just right. So let's make the American version of French onion soup. It happens to come from a restaurant that some of us have been to long ago, and some of us may have been to it recently, but it's Applebee's French onion soup. So they have to make this in mass quantities, which they do. But it's a pretty simple soup. The prep time is less than 15 minutes. You cook it for a while because you're going to cook the broth in a large stock pot. So you're going to knock out butter, then you're going to knock out a little bit of oil. So why do you ask, do you put two different fats when you're cooking? When you put butter and when you put oil together, it allows the butter not to burn, and it allows the butter to be cooked at a higher temperature. So when you're cooking the onions, or for that matter, anything you're cooking, both the butter and the oil mix together, and you just need a little bit of a hint of oil in there. But that allows the butter to be cooked at a higher temperature. Butter has a threshold that it can be warmed and melted and even incorporated. But when you are going at a higher heat, which you'll want to do for this onions, you want to put a little oil in there. It keeps butter from burning. Now, brown butter is great, but burned butter is terrible. And if you've ever smelled a house with burnt butter, like say you're making some scrambled eggs, or you put some butter in a pan to start a recipe and you forget about it, that is not a smell you want. It stays in the wherever you've cooked it, and it's just not pleasant. So add a little oil. That's today's cooking advice, is to put those two together. And this Applebee's French onion soup recipe does include that. So I encourage you to do that. So let's talk about the onions that we're going to work on today. So today we have a white onion, which I've already peeled off the skin and started to prepare it. But if you want, you could also put a red onion in for a little variation. Now, with this recipe, what you're going to find is both a yellow onion, a white onion, or a red onion are more than acceptable. I sometimes put a little bit of both just for a variation, just to kick it up a little bit. But this recipe calls for white sliced onion, and that's what this is. So with the white sliced onion, what you're going to find is, just slicing it up, you need to make 10 cups of sliced onion. You don't want to sit there and measure out 10 cups of white onion after you've chopped them up. Just select out of your pantry about 2.5 pounds of onions, and you'll get there. That's about 7 large onions. Now, when you get your onions from the grocery store, you might have a couple large ones in the pile. You might have a couple small ones. You might have some bruised ones that you got to throw out. But whatever you do, you want to dice up 7 onions for this recipe. And this recipe makes enough for 8 servings. So say we're cutting this back to a smaller amount. So if I had 8 recipes made, or 8 servings made for this recipe, I'd be having a small get-together party at my house. We're not going to do that. We're still in a pandemic. We're still watching what we do as far as visiting with friends and family. So you can take this recipe and basically back it off a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to chop up 4 onions for my recipe and cut basically the recipe in half. So I'm going to try to make about 5 cups of sliced onion for 4 servings. And I'm going to make 2 servings, one for my wife, my executive producer, and myself. And then I'll make a second one that I freeze. And why do I freeze it? Because there are times where I get busy. And when I do, I still want some warm soup to start off the meal. And this will allow me to just take that frozen second cup of 2 servings of soup and make that, warm it up, and I don't have to go through all the pans and all the chopping, etc. So there's the next thing in here is garlic. This is a garlic clove, very simple. You can also use dry garlic as a spice if you prefer. This recipe calls for, a couple of good garlic cloves that you chop and prepare for the recipe. There is nothing better than onions and garlic and butter, and how the house might smell for that. So let's talk about what makes the broth. This is not a vegetable broth. This is not a broth made with chicken soup, although you could use it. But what you mainly do is you use beef stock. Beef stock is not as prevalent as vegetable or chicken stock, but you can easily get this at the store. Now, please note, this is Swanson's cooked stock with beef. I also have chicken. This is a bit of an education. This is Kroger's beef stock, but notice the label says beef flavor. The second ingredient is a little bit of beef flavoring. However, that's why I use the beef stock, because the beef stock is actually, the first ingredient is beef. So they're putting a large browned beef piece of meat in there with some bone for some marrow, a little bit of water, and it makes a much better, heartier stock using it that versus, hey, let's put some water and let's flavor it with something that tastes like beef. So in my opinion, get beef stock and get either Kroger's beef stock or Swanson's beef stock. Both are very nice. They come in a nice carton. This carton here makes 4 cups, which is what I'll use for today because I'm cutting the recipe. But that beef flavored is fine. However, it will not, the beef stock will make a better recipe and a better flavor. That's just my opinion. So that's the difference between beef flavor and beef stock. Next thing is a little bit of black pepper, a little bit of salt. That allows, the simple ingredients to be to your taste and add it accordingly. And then when we finish this dish, we'll cook that beef stock and onions with the garlic for a good bit of time. We'll let that cook probably for 30 to 45 minutes. What you're trying to do is incorporate the beef stock with the onions to make the base of your dish. Now for today's little kitchen item, I'm going to show you what I call one of my favorite little tools. It gets stored, but when I need it, I love it. And it's really a crock. It's a soup crock. It's got a nice little, it's oven safe, so it can go up to the ingredients I need or under the broiler. And it's got a cute little lid. Now, in this dish, I'll put the lid aside because inside here will be some cheese, and you don't want to get stuck to the lid. But if you had chicken soup, tomato soup, or something that doesn't have that would stick to the top, it's a nice way to present it with that little cute top, and it keeps the soup warm. What keeps this soup warm in this is a nice little baguette of bread, French baguette, that has Parmesan cheese and provolone cheese on it that gets finished in a broiler. Really makes for a fine addition to the soup. So let's talk about cooking first, you're going to cook in the stock pot, your butter and your oil. You're going to brown and saute the onions with a little bit of salt. That will allow it to brown. It takes about 30 minutes for that to occur. What you also want to try to encourage, and I've looked at a couple of recipes that really stress this, beyond the recipe I provided for you today, is you want that brown bits. What are brown bits? Brown bits are the things that form on the bottom of the pan that are just taste buds. They're wonderful. They add to the dish. And you'll caramelize these onions for 30 minutes, and those brown bits will get on the bottom of whatever pan you are fixing. So when you put the beef stock in it after they've caramelized, those beef bits will basically dislodge from the bottom of the pan, and you'll keep on circulating those in the soup beef stock. What I like about that is it adds another layer of flavor. And I was looking at one of my favorite cookbooks, and in their recipe, they caramelize these onions for 40 minutes. And the reason they do that is they really like the caramelized brown bits on the bottom of a dish. So that's what's great about this, is it does provide that little bit of a flavor that you want. Once your onions have caramelized, and you'll know they're caramelized, they'll be brown. They'll go from white, yellow, or red. They'll become brown. They'll literally be a brown mix of onions and garlic with your oil and butter. And it'll be very fragrant. You'll smell it and you go, oh, that smells good. Now is when you want to add the beef stock in. So get your beef stock out, enter it into the onion pot. Once you enter it into the onion pot, what you'll find is that you're going to let this cook with the beef stock and onions in it for about 35, 45 minutes. Very low heat. You don't have to robustly cook this. because most of the ingredients in it are already cooked. Your onions have caramelized with your garlic. The butter has incorporated itself, and all you're doing is incorporating the broth with the onions to make the base of the soup. Once you've created this base of soup, you want to ladle the soup into this tool of the day, which is your cute little soup. Now, if you don't have these available to you, I got those as a special bonus a couple years ago when I was ordering from a mail order company. They threw them in as a free gift. They've been kind of cute. I'm kind of glad I have them. But if you don't have that, just take your bowl out and prepare it with the soup in it, and you're ready to go. Just if you want, you can put a little bit of bread on it, a little bit of toasted croutons or toasted baguettes, or a little bit of Parmesan cheese, and you've got what I consider a really nice dish. Some people do not like this baguette in the top of their soup. Why is that? People say, oh, it gets soggy. Oh, it deters from the taste of the soup. It's just another layer of soup. If you don't want bread in your soup, don't put it in. If you want, what this recipe calls for is a toasted baguette or crouton that has provolone cheese and also has Parmesan cheese. And you can also do Parmesan cheese, if you like, from Kraft in their shredded component. So this goes on the top. It sits on top of the soup that you've ladled in the bowl. And once you put it in there, then you just put a little bit of cheese on it, slip it under the broiler, get it nice and toasted. And I assure you, you'll love that cheese gooey with the little bit of soaked bread mixed in with the brown beef stock and caramelized onions. So that'll be a real nice touch. So let's talk about some other things that you can do to enhance your recipe here. One of the things is Miner's beef stock. Now I have this with seafood, I have it with chicken stock, and today I have it with beef. And all of this Miner's is a simple, wonderful smelling beef, roasted beef that's been really dehydrated to a point that it's basically a paste. And all you're doing is you're adding this to your beef stock to enhance the taste of your beef stock. Now, I also have it with chicken. I also have it for seafood. You can also use this beyond just French onion soup with the beef, is you can use this chicken stock to make any one of the dressings you want to make or soup. You can always add it to soup. You can always add it to a gravy. It adds another level of cooking by putting in Miner's base. And I keep it in my refrigerator. I have it all the time. And I'd like to thank a friend of mine, Randy Brown, for introducing me to it as an addition. Randy's a professionally trained culinary chef, always does a great job. And he suggested that to us. And I find it to be a great addition to my cooking based on it. So that's one of the things that I would encourage you to do.
Hey, Gary?
Yes, sir.
My experience with the Miner's is that it has a high salt content.
That
so
is
you got to be very careful when you're making anything with the Miner's products, that you, if the recipe calls for salt, you want to adjust it, because you can really get too much salt in it.
Right. Good point, Scott.
Using that stock.
This is one of your cooker's friends right here, is a spoon. So you've caramelized the onion with a little bit of salt. That helps the onions to caramelize. But then you put the beef base in it with the Miner's, and you could, as Scott suggested, cause a problem with it being too salty. So what I like to do is I have a lot of spoons around when I'm cooking. Just taste it, test it. Just make sure before you add something more to it that you're not over salting. Some people are very salt sensitive, some are garlic sensitive, pepper sensitive. But I like to taste my soup. Sometimes I go to dinner And I've already had most of the dish because I've tasted it so many times. But take your spoon out, test it, make sure before you add the next thing. It always says in most recipes, season to taste. And what that's saying is there could be components, as Scott mentioned, that add to the dish. There are times where salt's already in preparations. You could take your butter. Now this is unsalted butter for this dish, but there's a lot of salt that is contained in butter. So if you had salted butter, that could already be incorporated in the dish as well. So be careful. Always taste it, and always add salt and pepper to taste, particularly if someone in your house doesn't like too much salt, and it can really ruin a dish. It's hard to take salt out, but it's very easy to add. So if you have somebody that doesn't like a lot of salt, what you can do is serve it the way you do, and by doing so, have a salt shaker on the table. If somebody wants a little bit more salt in their soup, they can always add it, and it doesn't ruin the dish. But if you put too much in, what you're going to find is those, it's very difficult to take out. You can put raw potatoes in and do it, but it's still very, very complicated. So, so that is today's recipe. Another ingredient you can put in, this is the French dish with Brennan's, is you can put a little bit of brandy in. A simple couple tablespoons of brandy is another way that you see French onion soup made with. Now, when you put brandy in and you're cooking it in the broth with the beef stock and the onions, the alcohol evaporates. And whenever you cook with alcohol, it eventually does evaporate. So note that, know that that will occur. And when it does occur, you will not really taste so much the alcohol, but the byproduct that the brandy preserves in the flavor of the soup. So that's another addition. You can always add brandy. You can always add in miner's beef base or chicken base if you have it. Adds another level of flavor, which is, what you're trying to do. You want to make it yours, you want to make it individual, and you want to come up with something that's special for you and your family. So the French edition from Brennan's has a lot more cream in it. Maybe you don't like cream. Maybe you don't like too much milk or too much dairy. Then go with the American version, and I think you'll find that that'll be a little bit easier for you. So that's today's French onion soup. This morning would have been an ideal time for it at 25 degrees. However, today will be 60, but by tonight, it'll start going down in temperature as soon as the sun goes down. So you can still, have soup with dinner. I have soup most days, unless it's exceptionally hot. And I think you'll enjoy this French onion soup. Very inexpensive, very easy to make, particularly the American version of French onion soup. And I think with some simple onions and some beef stock, maybe a baguette on top with some Parmesan cheese, you have a very satisfying either first start to your dinner or lunch, or maybe it's easily something you can make for dinner with a nice salad, maybe some cheese on the side, a little bit of fruit, and you have a wonderful, wonderful dinner made for you with French onion soup. Cooking with Gary.